On a spring morning in 1986, a female office worker in Arizona was having an eerie feeling of deja vu. While chatting with some of her coworkers in the break room at work, she started to notice this strange smell. The woman couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, but it was quite distinctive, and she was convinced that she had smelled it before. It was also alarming because the last time she'd encountered this odor, something very scary had happened to her. The woman was kind of lost in thought, standing there thinking about all of this, when suddenly she heard this commotion coming from down the hall. It was a couple of her colleagues who were shouting that something was seriously wrong and they needed to call 911 right away. Now, when the woman heard this, it only added to this intense sense of dread that she was feeling. However, little did she know the thing that she was worried about and what was happening down the hall, they were more connected than she ever could have imagined. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. Also, I know this story is a bit older than a lot of the cases we normally cover, but I promise you this one is worth it. It's full of twists and turns, and honestly, it's hard to overstate just how crazy this one is. With that out of the way, let's dive in. March 24th, 1986 started off like a typical Monday for 46-year-old Julie Williams. After waking up that morning, like every weekday, she ate breakfast and got herself ready before getting into her car and driving to the office where she worked in the city of Tempe, Arizona. Julie worked as an escrow secretary for Transamerica Corporation. While Transamerica is known for being a massive financial services and insurance company, Julie worked at a very small branch. They mostly specialized in title insurance for local residences and commercial real estate, and there was just a handful of people working out of this specific office. Julie didn't mind that at all, though. She'd only been there for about 2 months at this point, and even though the job mostly consisted of handling paperwork all day, she got along well with her small group of coworkers. Part of the reason Julie had only recently started working here was that she hadn't been in Arizona all that long either. She'd actually spent most of her life in California, where she'd grown up and also raised her now 3 adult daughters. After getting divorced about 2 years earlier, though, she'd ended up coming to Arizona and moving in with her daughter Nancy and her son-in-law Mike in Mesa. The last couple of years had been tough for Julie, but recently it felt like she'd really started to find her footing. On top of things going well at work, she'd gotten more integrated into her community, particularly at the church where she'd become a regular in nearby Phoenix. Anyway, after arriving at work that morning, Julie began her usual routine. She dropped off her stuff at her desk and unpacked a couple of things before heading to the little office kitchenette where some of the other employees were already gathered. Being that it was a Monday, everyone was a little slow to get going. Picture the sort of stereotypical office break room environment. You know, people hanging around, chatting about their weekends, not really in a rush to get to business. In fact, speaking of workplace stereotypes, the group of them were literally standing around the office water cooler. As Julie walked into the room, she said good morning to everyone and immediately grabbed a cup of water from the cooler. She was actually the first one to do this that day, which again shouldn't have been anything special. Except as soon as Julie actually drank the water, she got this really strange look on her face. After kind of pausing for a second, Julie said that the water tasted funny and that it felt like her lips and tongue were burning. She said that she was going to go to the bathroom for a second, but that in the meantime, she didn't think anyone else should drink from the cooler. Despite this warning, a couple of the other employees were too curious to resist. A guy named Glenn and a woman named Deborah grabbed cups of their own, but they quickly realized Julie wasn't kidding around. The water tasted so weird that they ended up immediately spitting it out. Now, at first, no one thought that this was a huge deal. The employees figured they'd just call the company that handled the water delivery to the office and complain, and everything would get sorted out. As a result, most of them put the situation out of their minds and just continued with their conversations. However, a few minutes later, when Julie's coworkers finally headed to their desks, they noticed that she still had not returned from the bathroom. Deciding that they should see if she was okay, a couple of them went to check on her. Unfortunately, though, Julie was not okay. When her colleagues entered the bathroom, they found her collapsed inside one of the stalls there. She was completely unresponsive, and it was clear that something was very wrong. Hey, Nigel from the future here again, and today I've got something to show you. Unfortunately, this isn't a classified government document or some sort of sealed police file. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It's an example of what's known as a data broker report. A whole bunch of someone's personal information that's been bundled up and put together so it can be sold to the highest bidder. There are lots of companies out there putting together these kinds of reports. In fact, data brokers make a ton of money collecting and packaging our private information. What's even more alarming is that they're pretty good at their jobs. While we've redacted the sensitive information in this report, as you can see, the level of detail here is pretty staggering. These companies know everything from your phone number, email, and home address to who your neighbors and family members are and where you went to school. The sad truth is that in our increasingly online world, these kinds of details are only becoming easier for data brokers to find, especially because it seems like every service and app we use these days is demanding increasingly larger amounts of our personal information, to the point that it can begin to feel like we've only really got two equally crazy choices. Either accept the fact that our privacy is just going to be endlessly invaded, or completely detach from the modern world and go off-grid like some sort of hermit. Thankfully, though, there is another way, and that's where the sponsor of today's video, Aura, comes in. You see, what these data brokers don't want you to know is that they're actually legally required to remove your information if you ask them to. Now, they make that as difficult as possible for you to do, but Aura takes care of the hard part. They reach out to these companies on your behalf, automatically remove your information, and make sure it stays off. That's just the beginning though, because Aura offers a lot of other features as well. Things like real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, notifications if your information is found on the dark web, and a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and more. I've personally been using Aura for quite a while now, and I've been really happy with their service. If you'd like to check them out as well, they're currently offering 14 days free to Crime Zone viewers. To get started, head on over to aura.com/crimezone or check out the link in the description below. That's aura.com/crimezone to start taking back control of your digital privacy today. Even though paramedics were quick to arrive after Julie's coworkers called 911, by the time Julie made it to the hospital, she was in a coma. Initially, doctors believed she'd suffered a major stroke, but that changed when they got a closer look at her symptoms and learned more about the circumstances of what had happened that morning. Specifically, that detail about the strange-tasting water in Julie's office. Sure enough, when Tempe police got to the scene and started investigating, everyone's worst fears were confirmed. When the office water cooler was tested, it was discovered that it was contaminated with cyanide. Miraculously, because the other two employees who drank from the cooler never actually swallowed the water, they ended up being okay. Sadly, though, the same could not be said for Julie. The exact way that cyanide poisoning works is kind of complicated, so I won't get into the full explanation here. But for those unfamiliar, basically, when consumed, cyanide blocks the body from being able to use oxygen at the cellular level. Because of this, you essentially suffocate from the inside, even though you're still technically breathing and there is oxygen available in your blood. Yeah, pretty awful stuff. Depending on how much you ingest, cyanide poisoning can have a variety of symptoms, including chest pains, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, and of course, breathing problems. And there are antidotes that can be administered, even for large doses. But timing is a huge factor here. Not only is cyanide incredibly fast-acting, once your body's supply of oxygen is cut off for long enough, particularly to your brain, there's really no coming back. Heartbreakingly, this is what happened to Julie Williams. By the time she made it to the hospital and doctors figured out what was going on, she had suffered catastrophic and irreversible brain damage. She would remain in a coma for 2 more days before her daughters made the agonizing and impossible decision to take her off of life support. While this sudden and devastating loss was bad enough on its own, the whole thing was about to get even worse. And that's because it was pretty obvious what had happened here was no accident. You see, though cyanide is a naturally occurring chemical, it's not generally among the contaminants you would expect to find in a circumstance like this. Unless you're bottling your water from the tailing pond at a mining site, cyanide doesn't just casually show up in the office water cooler, especially not this amount. I mentioned before that the water in the cooler was tested. Well, the results showed that there was enough cyanide in there to kill at least 150 people. And disturbingly, this was not the only place the toxic chemical was found. In addition to the cooler, police collected a number of other items from the office's kitchen. Everything from the milk and cream in the fridge to the mugs and coffee pot, they were all contaminated with cyanide as well. I should also say too, in the case of the coffee pot and mugs, this was not subtle. That's because the specific form of the compound used was potassium cyanide, which is a salt-like crystal. It had dissolved into all of the liquids, but it was just lying there in heaps at the bottom of the mugs and coffee pot. This was helpful and actually somewhat relieving in the sense that it ruled out the source of the contamination coming from the water supply company. Remember the infamous Chicago Tylenol murders, where 7 people were killed when Tylenol products were randomly poisoned. That had only taken place 4 years earlier at that point. So fears about product tampering were still quite fresh in the public's minds. Also, potassium cyanide was the poison used in that case too. So yeah, authorities were grateful they weren't dealing with another situation like that. But at the same time, what had happened here was incredibly dark in its own way. This was a targeted attack, and whoever was responsible seemingly did not care how many people they killed. Of course, this left a number of questions. Who would want to murder the employees of Transamerica Corp? And for what reason? Also, were all of the employees being targeted, or did someone have a grudge against one of them in particular? Well, as it happened, one of the survivors of the crime thought she might have the answers to some of these questions. And what she told police would take the case in an equally bizarre and unsettling new direction. Since Julie Williams was the person actually killed in the poisoning attack, understandably, investigators had to consider the possibility that she might have been the intended victim. However, as they soon discovered, there was really no evidence to back that up. Julie had no known enemies, and she lived a fairly quiet life. Also, as I said before, she was the newest member of the office, and she got along well with everyone there. So this just didn't seem all that likely. The idea that the Transamerica employees in general were being targeted was also looked into, but the company hadn't received any threats police were aware of. It was all very confusing. That was, until they started talking to the other employees at the branch, and one of them came forward with an alarming story. That employee's name was Diane Harry. Diane was 29 years old. She'd worked for Transamerica for just under 2 years, and she was the woman I told you about at the beginning of this video. Diane explained that after arriving at the office that morning, she'd been hanging out in the break room with everyone else, when suddenly she'd started to notice this strange smell. Initially, she couldn't quite tell where it was coming from, but it was making her uneasy. The reason why was that she was convinced she recognized the smell. And the last time she'd been near it, something really scary had happened to her. Just 3 nights earlier, on Friday, March 21st, Diane said that she was relaxing at home after work when she decided to have a drink. After reaching for a bottle of whiskey, she poured herself a glass, but as soon as she took a sip, she could tell something wasn't right. The whiskey tasted really bad, and it smelled funny too. She stopped drinking it immediately and told her husband Louis when he got home a few minutes later. Louis tasted the whiskey as well, but like the other employees at the water cooler, he immediately spit it out. Diane said that as this was happening, she started to feel really sick. She was dizzy and nauseous, and she couldn't catch her breath. Thinking she just needed some air, she went outside for a second. For a moment, this seemed to do the trick, but when she came back in, she fainted. Diane said that thankfully she wasn't out for long, and that was the worst of it, but she'd spent the rest of the weekend feeling off. At the time, she thought she and her husband had simply gotten a bad bottle of liquor. But now, because of what had happened to Julie, she was having second thoughts. Again, it was the smell, though, that really bothered Diane. In her words, both the water cooler and the whiskey smelled like bitter almonds. This really caught the attention of detectives, and if you know anything about cyanide poisoning, you might already know why. This bitter almond smell is a telltale odor attributed to the toxic chemical. Anyway, all of this is to say that Diane was worried that she might actually have been the intended target of the attack at the office. And this would be confirmed when police got their hands on the bottle of whiskey from her home. Sure enough, when it was tested, it was also found to contain potassium cyanide. Not nearly as much as the amount in the water cooler, but still, Diane likely would have died if she'd had any more to drink that night. So yeah, someone had now tried unsuccessfully to kill Diane Harry twice. But who would do something like this? And why? Well, given that the first attempted poisoning had happened inside her own home, detectives immediately looked at Diane's husband, Louis Harry. But Diane was insistent Louis would never try to harm her. Diane told police that she and Louis were very much in love. It had been that way ever since they'd met about 5 years earlier, when they came across each other by complete chance at a volleyball game. Both Diane and Louis liked to stay active, and they bonded over their shared love of sports. Louis's life in particular revolved around athletics. When he wasn't playing tennis, he was usually volunteering his time refereeing basketball games for local church and youth leagues. Even his job was sports-focused. Louis worked as an equipment manager in the phys ed department at Phoenix's South Mountain Community College. Diane said that she and Louis had been married for 3 years now, and in all that time they never had any serious issues. She just didn't believe that Louis was capable of something like this. On top of all that, Diane pointed out that Louis had actually tried the poisoned whiskey as well when she had told him about it. He hadn't gotten sick like she had, but still, why do it at all if he knew what was in there? Additionally, Diane said Louis was the reason police were even able to test the poisoned whiskey in the first place. She'd thrown the bottle in the trash the day after she got sick, but Louis had taken it out and saved it because he was suspicious. Now, why was Louis suspicious, you might be wondering? Well, that's what police wanted to know as well. And this is where Diane came forward with another shocking revelation. She said that for the last few weeks, she and her husband had been the victims of a disturbing campaign of threats and harassment. Diane explained that it all started a couple of months ago when Louis kind of unknowingly got himself in the middle of a bad situation. A woman who he'd recently become friends with, named Verbrae Wooten, confided in him about a frightening ordeal she was going through with a former boyfriend, a 43-year-old delivery driver named Roy Fitzpatrick. Verbrae told Louis that she met Roy about 5 years earlier, and they'd only really dated for about 3 weeks. They just didn't really click. But when Verbrae tried to end things, Roy turned into a complete psycho. Not only had Roy started stalking Verbrae, he'd actually attacked her multiple times. He told her that he would never accept that their relationship was over and threatened to kill her on countless occasions. Just to give you an idea, when police later spoke to Verbrae and she confirmed all of this, she recalled how, quote, Roy would tell me what he did to women while he was in Vietnam and said that's what he would do to me if I ever dated anyone else. Apparently, Roy never elaborated on exactly what he supposedly did to women in Vietnam, but, I think we can all agree that's an absolutely crazy thing to say to somebody. According to Diane, Louis also agreed, and upon hearing that Verbrae had been dealing with this for years now, he told her that she needed to do something. He said that she should file a restraining order against Roy, and he even offered to go with her to the courthouse if she was scared to do it alone. Verbrae was hesitant at first, but recently she decided to take Louis's advice. While this had sort of worked for Verbrae, unfortunately it had backfired for Louis and Diane. Roy was furious about the restraining order. And since he had been stalking Verbrae, it didn't take long for him to find out about Louis's involvement. That's when he turned his anger towards him and Diane. Diane said that for the last few weeks, they'd been receiving these letters from Roy in the mail. Some were addressed to her and some were addressed to Louis, but pretty much all of them were unhinged. Now, I'm not going to read the full text of most of these letters because a lot of them are littered with a certain racial slur that begins with the letter N. But as you can see, we've included a censored example of one of them on screen. At this point, Louis and Diane had received 7 of these, and the letters were only growing more threatening. The final one that they'd gotten right before the fatal attack at Diane's office was particularly ominous. It addressed Diane by her maiden name and read, quote, Ms. Mason, Once again, I am having a hard time overlooking your husband or friend, Harry A. Lewis, and his girlfriend, Verbrae Ann Wooten. It looks as if you did not have that talk with them and ask them to leave me alone, or for him to leave Verbrae the hell alone. I cannot allow for him to have the both of you. So since I have had Verbrae, I think what I am going to do is take you away from him so that he can see just how it feels. Then when I take his life, I will then be able to have the both of you. I have asked him to meet with me so that we can settle this whole once and for all, which is what I am doing again, any time or place he wants to. That is, if he has become a man yet. Diane told the detectives that the letters had freaked her and Lewis out so much that they decided they needed to be prepared to defend themselves. In fact, Lewis had purchased her a 9mm handgun to carry around for her protection and had taken her out to practice shooting it. This had made them feel a little bit safer because they assumed that if Roy was going to do something, he would attack them directly. Clearly, though, they'd been wrong. When detectives spoke to Lewis Harry, he told the same story as Diane. He also handed over all of the threatening letters from Roy Fitzpatrick, which lined up with everything both of them had said so far. As I mentioned before, authorities also spoke with Verbrae Wooten. She further backed up Lewis and Diane's claims, stating that Roy was definitely capable of something like this. She said that for the last 5 years, Roy had made her life hell, and that there was no line he wasn't willing to cross to try and control her. With the evidence against Roy seemingly increasing minute by minute, police reached out to him and asked if he was willing to speak with them. At first, he refused, but a day later, he called them back and said that he was ready to talk. This is where the case gets even crazier, because Roy, he did not deny sending those disturbing letters to Lewis and Diane Harry. However, strangely, he still claimed that he was innocent and that he had a story of his own that he needed to share. So yeah, things were not looking good for Roy Fitzpatrick. And when investigators sat down with him, they were kind of thinking, what could this guy possibly want to tell us? I mean, he admitted to sending the letters, so case closed, right? Well, not exactly. You see, while Roy confessed that he had a grudge against the Harrys, he said that he was not angry at them because of the restraining order. In fact, he claimed he was the one who was actually being harassed. And though that claim was pretty laughable, what he said next definitely got detectives interested. Roy said that the reason he was so upset was that Lewis Harry was having an affair with his ex-girlfriend, Verbrae. It turned out that despite the restraining order, Roy had continued to stalk Verbrae, and as a result, he'd seen her together with Lewis a number of times. One night a few weeks ago, he'd followed Lewis home after watching him leave Verbrae's apartment building, which is how he'd learned that Lewis was a married man. Roy said this outraged him, which is why he'd started sending the letters. But he said this was all he had done. His intention was simply to let Lewis know he'd been caught and that he was going to expose what was happening to his wife if he didn't cut off his relationship with Verbrae. He said he wasn't involved in any poisonings and that he certainly hadn't killed anyone. Now, obviously, Roy's credibility was highly questionable, so like they had before, police tried to see if they could verify any of this. To their surprise, when they spoke to Verbrae again, she told them that some of what Roy said was true. Specifically, she admitted that, yes, she was involved in a romantic relationship with Lewis Harry. Verbrae said the reason that she hadn't mentioned this before was that she believed Lewis and Diane were getting a divorce. She explained that she met Lewis at a club back in January, and he told her that he and Diane were separated. Verbrae said she was in love with Lewis and that he had actually proposed to her. They were now engaged, and they were just waiting for his divorce with Diane to be finalized. Of course, this was completely new information to police, because neither Diane nor Lewis had said anything about a divorce. But there was one other thing that made them rethink the investigation as well. Going back to the interview with Roy, at some point, detectives had started showing him the letters that they collected from the Harrys. This was because Roy was denying threatening the couple, and investigators were like, how can you say that when you're basically suggesting here that you're going to kill both of them? That's when Roy dropped another bombshell. You see, I told you before that Diane and Lewis received a total of 7 letters, but what I didn't tell you is that only the first 4 were handwritten. The last 3, the ones that were by far the most threatening, those had all been written on a typewriter. And while Roy confessed to writing the first 4 letters, he claimed that he had nothing to do with the other 3. As I'm sure you can imagine, at this point, detectives were beyond confused. None of this was making any sense, and they no longer had any idea who they could trust. The one thing they knew for sure, though, was that they needed real evidence. Luckily, they were about to get an incredibly lucky break. One that would finally begin to unravel this twisted web of a case. The day after the poisoning at the Tempe Transamerica branch, so March 25th, 1986, police conducted a search. They did this on a hunch after conducting all of those interviews I told you about. Now, this search was actually at another office, though one that was not at all connected to the Transamerica branch. But almost immediately after investigators went in, they could tell that this is where the crime had been planned. In addition to more traces of potassium cyanide crystals, which were found on a shelf in the office, police found some yellow legal pads on a desk. On those legal pads were parts of the last 3 letters sent to the Harrys, the ones that had been typed. It looked like someone was trying to practice what they wanted to say before copying it out on a typewriter. The most critical piece of evidence by far, though, was a couple of other pieces of paper, which were crumpled up and thrown in a garbage bin. These turned out to be a receipt and a fact sheet from a company called Chemonics Scientific. The receipt was for an order of 1 pound of potassium cyanide, and the fact sheet went over warnings and best practices for the handling and use of the chemical in scientific applications. The receipt showed that the cyanide had been purchased on March 7th, so just a couple of weeks before the poisonings. While the receipt was signed with the name Charles Hawley, police were certain that this was a fake name. And that's because of where this office was and who it belonged to. The office was on the campus of South Mountain Community College, and it belonged to Lewis Harry. Investigators ended up bringing in a handwriting expert to analyze the signature on the receipt and compare it with Lewis's own signature, and the expert was convinced that he was the one who had signed it. Normally, I have to say I'm not a big believer in handwriting analysis, but in this case, it was pretty hard to deny, especially when you look at the capital H's in Charles Hawley and Lewis Harry. If you're still skeptical, though, I don't blame you, but don't worry, there's plenty more. You see, not only was the representative at the chemical company who handled the transaction able to pick Lewis out of a photo lineup, he had used the school's account to make the purchase. And it was easy to trace this back to him because the college did not normally keep potassium cyanide anywhere on campus. One other kind of wild way police were able to link Lewis to the crime was through an envelope that was used to send one of the typewritten threatening letters. It turned out there was a manufacturer's defect in how this envelope had been cut. Instead of the 2 flaps meeting in the center like they were supposed to, one of them slightly crossed over the other. And when investigators were searching through Lewis's office, they found a box of these same envelopes, some of which had this exact defect. In fact, the issue was even more unique because of how it had happened. Basically, during manufacturing, envelopes are cut out of these massive reams of paper before being folded and glued. The cutting is done with these blades that are in a certain pattern that come down and press into the paper. And what had happened here was that the blades had gotten progressively more and more misaligned. The envelopes had started off a little off, but the defect had become more and more noticeable with each cut. So when investigators went back and looked at the envelope from that typewritten letter and compared it to the other defective ones found in Lewis's office, they fit together like a series where you could see the cutting error getting larger and larger. So yeah, pretty unique and a strong indicator these envelopes had all come from this same box. As damning as all of this was, though, there was still an important piece of the puzzle missing. While police had always known it would have been easy for Lewis to poison Diane the first time when she drank the tainted whiskey, how had he gotten into her office? While Diane's branch was small, it was located in a newer office park that had decent security. The building was completely locked on the weekends, and the only way to gain entry was to use a key card. Well, when detectives obtained the records from the security system, it showed that Diane's card had been swiped at the building at 10:18 a.m. on March 22nd, so the Saturday right before Julie Williams was killed. It turned out there were also contractors doing some work in one of the units there that weekend. No one had seen a woman entering the complex that Saturday, but one of the workers recalled seeing a man while he was waiting outside to be let into the job site. That man arrived right around the time that Diane's card had been used to access the building. Unlike the representative at the chemical supply company, the worker wasn't able to pick Louis Harry out of a photo lineup, but his basic description of the man he'd seen was a match to Louis. What the worker also remembered was that the man was driving a blue sports car with a tennis racket in the back window. These details likewise matched Louis Harry. Putting all of this together, investigators felt like they finally knew what had happened. In January of 1986, so 2 months before the poisonings, Louis Harry met Verbrae Wooten at a club. The two of them started an affair, with Louis lying to Verbrae and telling her he was in the middle of a divorce with his wife. Police believed that initially Louis never intended on actually leaving Diane. Sure, he was unhappy in his marriage, but Diane made more money than him and was responsible for their decent quality of life, so he was just going to keep stringing Verbrae along as long as possible. This had worked until Verbrae's lunatic ex-boyfriend Roy found out about what was going on and started blackmailing Louis with threatening letters. While most people would have seen this as a bad thing, Louis saw it as an opportunity to get everything he wanted. He figured that he could kill Diane, frame Roy, and that by doing this, he would be free to start a new life with Verbrae. In order to accomplish this, Louis sent himself even more threatening letters, which he tried to make appear as though they had also come from Roy. At the same time, he purchased a large amount of potassium cyanide under a false name, believing it wouldn't be traced back to him. On March 21st, Louis poisoned the bottle of whiskey, which he knew Diane would drink from when she got home. However, things didn't go according to plan. Diane didn't drink enough of the cyanide-laced liquor to actually kill her. But Louis knew he still needed to cover his tracks and make the case against Roy look bad. So he saved the bottle of whiskey so that police could test it later, and he also took a sip from the bottle when Diane asked him about it, though was careful to not actually swallow any. Right afterwards, as Diane was experiencing all of those terrifying effects of the cyanide she'd unknowingly ingested, Louis was in the bathroom vigorously washing out his mouth and brushing his teeth to make sure he was safe. The next morning, when Diane was still understandably feeling sick, Louis took advantage of this and swiped her office keycard. After driving to the building, he used her keys to get inside the actual Transamerica branch, where he proceeded to poison the water cooler. At this point, Louis wasn't taking any chances, though. He wanted to make sure his wife died this time, so he put a massive amount of cyanide in the cooler, as well as everywhere else he could think of, fully well knowing this might result in everyone in Diane's office being killed. Of course, once again, things didn't go the way that Louis planned, and Diane survived this second attempt on her life. But he knew that he still had to fully commit in order to avoid becoming a suspect, so he did his best to pin the crime on Roy Fitzpatrick. Now, you're probably wondering, why wouldn't Louis just actually get a divorce if he wanted to be with Verbrae? Well, that's a really good question. And while police could never say definitively why Louis did what he did, they theorized the crime was at least partially about money. Diane Harry had a personal life insurance policy for $75,000, another one through her work for $32,000, and an additional $5,000 in company stock. If she died, Louis would have been the primary beneficiary of all that money. And remember, this was 1986, so really $112,000 was even more money than it sounds like when you adjust for inflation. Plenty for him to start over with Verbrae. After all of this came together, Louis Harry was arrested and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, as well as 4 counts of attempted first-degree murder. If you thought the case couldn't get any stranger from here, well, sadly, you'd be wrong. Following his arrest, Louis ironically claimed that he was being set up, and that he was actually innocent. And while perhaps that's not the most surprising thing in the world, what is surprising is who believed him. Both Diane and Verbrae stuck by Louis, even as the details of the police investigation started to be released to the public. In fact, not only did Diane pay for Lewis's legal defense until she ran out of money, she was featured in a nearly half-page profile piece in the newspaper The Arizona Republic, where she laid out all of the reasons why she believed her husband was innocent. That's actually how we know so much about Diane's experience throughout this whole story, and how everything unfolded from her perspective. When the case made its way to trial in the fall of 1986, both Diane and Verbrae testified in Lewis's defense. They said that they did not believe he was guilty and that Roy was the actual perpetrator, even though they admitted that by this point they knew Lewis had been lying to them about the affair. This is actually even wilder than it sounds, because as Lewis himself would confess on the stand, this wasn't the first time he cheated on Diane. During their 3-year marriage, he'd had at least one other affair that she apparently didn't know about. On top of this, during her testimony, Verbrae revealed Lewis had gotten her pregnant when they were together, though she'd ended up losing the pregnancy. According to reports from the time, Diane and Verbrae even sat next to each other in court. Unfortunately for Lewis, while he may have had the two women fooled, the rest of the case against him had only grown stronger by the time the trial started. Not only had investigators recovered his fingerprints from a number of the poisoned items inside the Transamerica office, during a search of his and Diane's home, 2 cigar tubes filled with a bunch more potassium cyanide were found. This was in addition to damning testimony from a colleague of Lewis's, Robert Telenick. Robert worked as a lab technician at South Mountain Community College, and he testified that about 3 weeks before the poisonings, Lewis had started asking him a bunch of questions about cyanide. Specifically, Lewis wanted to know how much cyanide would kill someone and where he could buy it. Robert said that when he asked Lewis why he wanted to know this, he claimed the information was for a friend who was researching the Chicago Tylenol murders. Lewis, meanwhile, stuck to his story that it was all a setup. He claimed there were reasonable explanations for all of the stuff that looked terrible for him. However, most of these supposed explanations didn't make a whole lot of sense. For instance, he claimed his fingerprints were at Diane's office because she called him about the weird smell on the morning of Julie's murder, and he stopped by to investigate. While it appears Diane did call Lewis that morning, it's hard to imagine Lewis being allowed to just walk into the office right after something so serious had just happened and touch a bunch of stuff at what was essentially an active crime scene. In terms of the partially written threatening notes in his own handwriting that were discovered in Lewis's office, he said that those were there because he was copying down the contents of the typewritten letters after he'd received them. He claimed he did this because there were no copy machines available at the time. As for the employee who claimed that they saw Lewis buying the cyanide at the chemical company, Lewis said he couldn't remember going there. In the end, the jury did not buy these explanations, and Lewis Harry was convicted of the first-degree murder of Julie Williams, as well as all 4 counts of attempted first-degree murder. In case you're curious, the attempted counts were for the 2 employees who drank from the water cooler that did not die, as well as the 2 separate attempts on Diane's life. In February of 1987, Lewis Harry was sentenced to life in prison for Julie's murder, as well as a further 105 years for the attempted murder convictions. It was ruled that the sentences would run consecutively and that Lewis would have to serve 2/3 of each in order to be eligible for parole, meaning that he was looking at a minimum of 95 years behind bars. During the sentencing, the judge in the case called Lewis sociopathic, saying that the crime showed, quote, complete stupidity and senselessness. He went on to state, quote, twice the defendant tried to poison his loyal wife. When he poisoned the water, he had to know that anyone who drank it could or would die. The cold, calculated scheme to poison his wife shows a heinous state of mind. Based on what we were able to find, it doesn't seem as though Lewis ever took responsibility for his actions. When this case was covered back in 2006 on an episode of Forensic Files, he had this to say.
I'm very sorry for Julie Williams' family, for them to have gone through this. As far as the actual crime itself, I didn't commit the crime, so it's kind of hard to have remorse for something that I didn't do.
Lewis Harry remained incarcerated all the way up until the time of his death in June of 2021, at the age of 68. I'm sure many of you want to know, did Diane ever come around to accepting the truth about her husband? Well, unfortunately, the answer is we just don't know. Some sources seem to suggest that she did, especially after being confronted with the totality of the evidence against Lewis, but we weren't really able to confirm this. As for Verbrae, she eventually did accept that Lewis was responsible for everything that had happened. She was featured in that same episode of Forensic Files I mentioned, where she astutely observed during her interview that she realized years later that the struggle between Roy and Lewis was never really about her. It was about their own egos. In my opinion, though, the saddest thing about this case isn't the betrayal or the lies, though all of that is terrible. What gets me most is in the absolute circus that is this case, it's really easy for Julie's story to get lost. Sadly, not much has ever been released publicly about Julie's life, but in the few mentions of her we came across in newspaper articles and media reports, no one had a bad thing to say about her. She was a devoted mother who loved her daughters and her church, and who, according to those close to her, never hurt anyone in her life. Julie was only 46, and she should have had many more years ahead of her. Instead, she became a cruel victim of circumstance, a truly innocent victim who was seen as nothing more than collateral damage by a person who only cared about fulfilling his own selfish desires. Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, one of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation, though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.